When you get a little bit more serious about your running journey, the weight of your own expectations can become a bit of a burden when you're trying to continually chase personal bests. Now, when you first start out in your running journey, there's a little bit more innocence there. You don't really care about the outcome, you sort of take it as it comes, and you can actually get fitter pretty quick. You can also knock off some sizable amount of time from half marathons and marathon attempts. But what tends to happen after you've established some early PBs across some different events is you start to potentially develop some expectations surrounding how you want to perform in future events. So for example, you might have knocked off a really quick 10-kilometer time, so now all future 10K times are going to be referenced against that benchmark. And it's here that we're, with these early developments of expectations, that we start to develop the dreaded P word, being pressure. There's a little bit more pressure there to perform up to those expectations that we've set based on what we've done previously. Now, with pressure, it's not all inherently bad. It is if you're wired like me, I guess. But with pressure, potentially becomes things such as impatience to reach a goal by a certain amount of time, which then can potentially lead into desperation, which is an extreme version where it starts to affect the way you train and go about your running. But importantly though, runners don't generally fail because they lack the desire or want. They generally fail because they want it too much, as a bit of a paradox. They get in their own way in their training. But how would I know that? Well, we're going to go through that in this video and hopefully allow you to take the pressure off chasing some personal bests on your running journey. So let's get stuck into it. So to start the video, I want to talk about some of my own performances in running and how I've performed really well in some events and how I haven't performed as well in others. So to start off, I'll chat about some of my half marathon attempts because they've probably been my best running performances to date. So I'll tell you a story about my early half marathon PB. So it was probably maybe my third half marathon attempt. And I ended up knocking 11 minutes off this personal best attempt, which was really good. It was on a much harder course, really hilly, and I was really proud of the way I performed. And the reason why I talk about this is because it's probably one of the few runs where I've run completely free and detached from whatever happened on that day. So to give you a bit of context, I had this run on the Sunday morning. On the Friday night, it was my birthday, and so I was out with a few friends and didn't get home until pretty late. So had a few drinks, but I was completely relaxed about whatever was going to happen on the Sunday. In fact, a few people had asked me that night, they're like, "Oh, you got a half marathon on Sunday. Like, are you going to be okay to do this? You shouldn't you be preparing for that?" And by no means am I condoning like having a decent night 2 days before an event, but I was completely calm about my training, what I'd done. I knew I'd put in the work in, and I knew that I'd still be fine for Sunday. I just inherently knew there was no real pressure there for me to perform, really. But what ended up happening was completely blew it out of the park, and I was absolutely ecstatic with what happened, mainly because I knew I was going to be okay. But for me, my ultimate running goal has always been to run a sub 3-hour marathon. Haven't quite done that yet. I've gotten pretty close. I've run a 3:01, so I'm not too far off. But for me, pressure and running has always surrounded me in terms of my full marathon attempts. So my first marathon was the Melbourne Marathon in a couple of years ago. I wanted to run a 3:35 as an opening marathon attempt. Ended up running a 3:37, which I was pretty happy with. Like, it was my first attempt. Didn't know what I was sort of in for. I was pretty sick in the lead up to it. So I thought, that's pretty good to start with. 9 months later, I was running the Gold Coast Marathon, and I had more expectations surrounding this. This was my second marathon. I was a lot fitter. I was in really good nick, and the Gold Coast is a really flat course, and if you're going to run a PB, it's going to be at the Gold Coast. Anyway, probably about a month leading up to that event, I started to get a little bit anxious, a little bit worried, because I knew I was really close to breaking the 3 hours. And with marathons like that, the margins are pretty small when it's, you're running that close to your top, for 3 hours or whatever it is. So started to get a little bit tight in the lead up to the event. And then the night before itself, I didn't get a wink of sleep at all. I don't reckon I slept I don't reckon I slept for an hour that night. So I was really anxious, and then I thought I'd completely derailed myself by not sleeping, and I was worried getting the start line, and ended up running a 3:06 for that marathon, which was a 31-minute PB, which is really good. but ended up hitting the wall about 5 or 6K out. So it was a little bit disappointing because I knew I could run better than that, but didn't, and sort of let the pressure and anxiety and expectation get to me on that day. So then we fast forward to the Sydney Marathon, which was last year. I thought I'd go closer to running 2:55 than 3:05, but still the same thing occurred in the lead up to it. The taper was a bit messy. I was a little bit anxious, having the phantom taper injuries or whatever. I was a bit better sleeping the night before that marathon. I think I got 4 hours sleep as opposed to no sleep. So from that perspective, it was really good, but there was still more pressure there because Sydney was a world major. They're hard to get into. It was the first one. And I knew that if I didn't knock off that 3 hour time then and there, that I wouldn't be, it'd be hard for me to come back and do it the next year. Anyway, I ran a 3:01. My fastest 2Ks of the race were the last 2Ks. I knew I was disappointed with the outcome because I just wasn't running to how I felt. I was running too tight, too rigid to a pace guideline, and wasn't running to how I felt, which was actually pretty good on the day physically. So that was pretty heartbreaking, and it really, I was really disappointed in that. So much so that I sort of let expectation and pressure get to me again by running the Melbourne Marathon about 8 to 10 weeks after Sydney. And my personal rule of thumb as a coach is to not begin structured training after a marathon attempt until at least 4 weeks after the event. I didn't do that. I circumvented recovery because I just wanted to hang on because I knew I was fit enough and Melbourne was an easier course to be able to run it. So I took 2 weeks off, then started running again, and then sure enough, things started to go a bit awry. I got a pretty sore left shin a couple of weeks out from the marathon, and then the week before it, my last fast run, I knew I was in trouble because I know the difference between a shin splint that's just inflammation and something a little bit more serious. And I thought to myself, I've probably got one run left in me here. And sure enough, I was right. Melbourne didn't go to plan. I was on track and again into about 35, 36K, and the left side of my body just couldn't handle it anymore. And we ended up sliding past the 3-hour mark to 3:04, which was still a really good attempt because I found out later on I'd run with a stress fracture. So the reason why I've just recapped my whole running life story, so hopefully you're still watching if you've gotten this far, is it just, the negative impact of the expectations and when it can go poorly when there's too much pressure on the goal setting process. And as I said, with my half marathon attempts, been really good because I was detached from whatever happened because I saw them as stepping stones to the marathon, whereas the marathon itself I see as the grand final day and there's way too much pressure. But what I really want to highlight here in the anchor point from this anecdote is that expectation, when it becomes too much, turns into pressure. Pressure, when that becomes too much, then turns into desperation, which then inevitably leads into either disappointment or injury. So why does PB pressure exist and where does it come from? So this is going to be my favorite topic in the whole video, and as a PhD scholar, although you probably wouldn't realize it, it's important that I attribute these ideas to the people who originally introduced them because they're not obviously mine, but I do feel like they have great scope for runners and can definitely help us out in our running journey. So we'll try and tag these as I go along, but I feel like personal best pressure exists mainly because we have a misunderstanding between goals and our expectations. So I'll say that again. We have a misunderstanding between our goals and our expectations. So as a practical example, goals in terms of running are the outcomes we want to achieve. So in my example, my ultimate running goal is to break 3 hours for a marathon. That's the outcome. Expectations are, however, things that are completely within our control that can affect that outcome. So again, it's the training, or me training and completing my training program and following that religiously is within my control and is within my expectations to achieve that long-term goal. But the problem is that we tend to treat goals as expectations. So what I mean by that is we tend to treat goals as if they're 100% within our control as our expectations are, which just isn't the case, and it's taken me a long time to realize this. So goals still have elements that aren't completely within our control. So for example, if I was a team sport athlete and I wanted to win the NBA championship as my goal, that's not firmly within my control as other teams have a say in that. Similarly, if I want to run 3 hours for a marathon, and the marathon date in question is going to be an absolute heat wave, the weather's going to have a say in how I perform that day, which we know from physiology checks out. And the Sydney Marathon a few years ago had a really hot day too. Similarly, if it's absolutely blowing a gale, that's going to have an impact in how I actually perform that day. So then what happens is, as I said, when we start treating these goals as expectations, we tend to increase and build that pressure. And that pressure usually comes from two sources. First one's internal pressure. So that's whatever emphasis or weight we place upon these running performances, upon ourselves. And then the second one is for the external sources. So, and that's probably becoming more and more prevalent in the social media age in which we live now. So, we have things like Strava and people posting all their running highlights on their social media. So it creates a little bit more of a social pressure, to be validated as a runner potentially. So, what I mean by that is that we want to be seen as a fast runner, or we want to be validated as we're running fast and we're part of this running community. Which in a good way, there are good elements to this, because as mere mortal runners, which a lot of us are, and I'm one of them certainly, is we're not going to be chasing world championships or world records in events, or or even reach the podium in our local races. So the only real form of success that we have in different events is our own personal best. So it's our goal is to knock time off our personal best, which is inherently healthy to race against yourself. It's just when there's that more, it turns into pressure, that it becomes counterproductive. But the important point here, that's what they want to stress from this, is that slowly our running identity shifts from running as something that we do, like as an activity, as an outlet, into something that we are. So I'll say that again, is that slowly there's an identity drift with this rise in pressure, that running shifts from something that we do to not caring too much about it, to something that we are, where we attach more self-worth and validation upon our running results, which then builds that pressure and anxiety over trying to control something where we don't have complete control over. So how does pressure change your running behavior? So undoubtedly, once you reach a certain threshold internally, pressure is going to influence the way you act in terms of your running behavior. Now, from the top, I said that pressure doesn't make runners lazy. It just makes them more impatient and sometimes desperate, which can then change the way they go about their running. So, as the time to an event dwindles down, you try to make probably more decisions to give you more control over the outcome. And as I said, you probably don't have 100% control over it anyway. So you might start to tinker with your training program or do things to make it feel like you're still in control of whatever happens on that day. So the first one is you just chase too much intensity. Now, everybody's done this and guilty of this. So when it's late in your preparation, particularly the last 6 to 8 weeks in your specific phase, you try and inject a bit more intensity in there, because you think more is always going to be better. More volume, whether it's more volume or more intensity, you feel like, okay, more gives me a better chance, a better buffer in case something goes wrong. And, so I've done more work, I'm ready to go. The second one is you circumvent recovery, which, as I said from the top, I'm guilty of this, where, you don't think, recovery is important. It's more important to train, get more runs on the board, where, as we know, we actually get better during the recovery process with adaptation. But it's obviously easy for me to say that, but we just shorten those recovery timelines, and then don't take enough of it when we need to, particularly with down weeks and taper weeks and whatnot. Next one is ignoring injury signs. So again, we've all done this, where we've pushed through a niggle and it's probably made it worse, and you've actually prolonged your recovery time off the back of it. Obviously, I did this where I was probably bordering on a stress and then actually grew into one out of that pressure and that desire to actually want to achieve something. And then the next one is overanalyzing the taper process. So again, having the phantom injuries that always pop up during the taper, the niggles, the aches, the pains, the wanting more control over the taper, or am I doing too much? Am I doing too less? Instead of just relaxing and letting it unfold, which again, I think we're all guilty of. And then the last one is it's the old one more race potentially. So it's, okay, I'm in a really good fitness state. Let's push on or go for one more. I didn't get what I wanted this time around, so let's push on and go for another one or another result. to try and just really get what you're after when you're running. So I've spoken about the pressure, where it comes from, how it builds, how it changes your running behavior, but how do we get rid of it? How do we remove the pressure and the anxiety surrounding our performances in order to actually improve or go a bit better with our running? The important thing I want to state from the top is that having pressure or a want to achieve something is inherently a good thing. And we do need elements of this in our life to make us do things or to push us towards something that we actually, that's meaningful towards us. So there is elements of that are healthy and are going to push us in the right direction. But as I've said, it's when that gets a bit out of hand or actually, hinders our ability to go after it, is when it becomes a little bit more of a problem. So I do want to stress that off the top, is that you don't completely get rid of the anxiety or the pressure. But we do, however, we need to reframe it. So we need to be able to recycle it or reuse it in a way that's going to create a more kinder and gentler mindset for us to actually perform when that time comes. So when I've heard from high performers, or I've read books, or I've been lucky to hear from guest speakers or whatnot, because from my actual job, I have been lucky and fortunate enough to hear from a lot of people who have performed really well when it mattered in high pressure environments. I do actually have a job outside this, I should say. But the thing that I noticed, and the pattern that kept occurring to me, was that all these high performers, they all attributed their ability to perform in terms of their mindset from one of the following. And I'll read through this list because there is a fair bit on here, and then we'll summarize it after that. So the first thing that I've heard is that they stop caring as much. These high performers stop caring as much about the outcome. They remove the idea of consequences, both good and bad. They got into a flow state, which a lot of people talk about. That's a common thing. And the other one is they managed to stay present, or they separated their worth from the outcome, or they focused on the process and not the outcome, or they were committed but detached from the outcome, which is an important one, and it's just one that I really liked. I'll talk about that a little bit more now. So they detach themselves from the outcome, their self-worth from the outcome of whatever happened on that day, which is important because it gives you the freedom or the flow to be actually perform to your potential, to achieve whatever your goal is. But what does that actually mean though in practice? Like when someone says that, I detach myself from the outcome. Well, obviously that means that your self-worth isn't impacted by whatever happens. But practically, it just might mean that you like running, or you ran because you just liked running, or you liked the way that running made you feel when you first started, or it made you happy, or it made you feel healthy. It's getting back to that initial reason of why you liked running or why you were into it in the first place, to then allow yourself to get back in that flow, because it's not all about the outcome or the pressure to achieve and further push that PB in the right direction. And then paradoxically, as I've spoken about with my half marathon attempts, when it's not about not caring as much, it's just about, okay, well, I'll put the work in, I'll be dedicated, and then whatever happens with that, I can live with. So, paradoxically, when you detach, you become calm, clear, and you begin to find that flow state, that's almost mythical to some people, that allows you to perform the way you want to, and then your decision making on the back of that improves. You can think a little bit more clearly. There's a little bit more quality in your thoughts, particularly during a race itself, where you might need that clarity of thought depending on how you're going. So the key again from this part of the video is that you're committed, but you're detached from whatever happens. So again, I'll say that again. You're committed, but you're detached from the outcome, because your value and worth is not dependent upon that outcome or that race or that PB or whatever it might be. So lastly, how do you take the pressure down, which is a really good John Farnham song that I love. And I do want to stress that I'm not a psychologist or a mental health professional. I am a running coach, been around the high performance environment for all my working life, PhD in exercise physiology. So I do have some things and some tips and tricks and runs on the board, but I just want to highlight that I'm definitely not a psychologist, but I've definitely been around athletes and the psyche of athletes enough to have some sort of say in this area or this space. So it's important for me to say that. But I guess the anchor for this aspect of the video is the pressure drops when your identity and your timelines loosen surrounding, whatever your PB goal is or your ultimate running goal is. So, the first reframe I'd like to introduce is the idea of, as I've spoken about in the previous topics, is reframing your identity in running. So the key point here is that at a really corny and basic level is that you're enough whatever happens with your running. Your worth is not dictated to by how fast you run a 10K or a 5K. As much as it sounds silly to say that, like it's not, which should take the pressure off a little bit. As I said before, running is something that you do, it's not something that you are. When it becomes something that you are, that's when there's too much pressure and expectation upon the outcome itself. The second one is reframing goals. Now, I'm big on this one because I think there's some tangible progress that can be made. So, maybe reshaping those goals into something that's more of a process driven rather than just the outcome. So, what's in my control that I can actually, that I can perform and control, for want of a better word, that's going to lead to that outcome. So, it might be things such as, I want a negative split this race. Okay, so my pacing strategy is I want a negatively split, which is in my control, and it is a tangible thing that's going to help me, or most likely help me in achieving that outcome goal. And then the next one might be, okay, let's run to how I feel as opposed to what the watch says, because again, that's a trap that you can get yourself trained into where you just run to whatever the watch says as opposed to how am I actually feeling. Like I've done a lot of interval sessions where I've just stopped looking at the watch and only look at the watch at the end of that interval split and realized I've gone 3 to 4 seconds faster because I just wasn't watching the watch the whole time. So again, there's things there, okay, what are the things directly in my control that will actually help the outcome without focusing directly on the outcome itself. But, so there you go with that. Third one is reframing or reshaping timelines. As I said before, the instant gratification world in which we live now with social media and Strava and people fraudulently uploading their Strava times instead of chip times means that everybody wants things yesterday. You want to be the person who ran a sub 3 hour marathon in their second attempt, or they knocked off 50 minutes in 6 months of their marathon time. You need to reshape and reframe those timelines because they just don't matter and nobody really cares, to be honest. And what it does is just erodes enjoyment of that journey, because I feel like everybody still gets a kick out of looking back at their their first Strava run to where they are now and seeing the change. Like there's a lot of enjoyment there, but you tend to miss that. Gets lost in the wash because you're just too worried about achieving X by Y date. So you should treat whatever running event or PB that comes as a learning opportunity and as a chance to get better. And I think that'll help you along that journey of just loosening the pressure just a little bit. And then the last one, and I feel like it's probably the most important one, is reframing progress. So PBs aren't the only form of progress in your running. And I know it's hard to understand, particularly if you're younger and your prime years are still ahead of you in terms of athletic performance. But are you healthy? Is running a really good social outlet that allows you to catch up with people or widen your social circle? Like those are forms of progress as a human being. And eventually, like we're all going to run our last PB at some point. We're all going to get tapped on the shoulder by Father Time, who's going to tell us, okay, you've had enough of the continually getting faster. So now you need to attach something more meaningful to your running, or change the meaning surrounding your running, which is really important. And I really wanted to end on that note, because if you can find some pure enjoyment out of running now, then it's not going to be as tough a transition as when you get to 40 plus or 50 plus and you're just not going to be able to run as fast as what you used to, despite your best efforts. There you go, that's it. We've reached the finish line for this video, but I appreciate it if you've gotten this far, and thank you for watching. It's meant a lot to me to put this video together and script it, because it's something that's really impacted me upon my running journey, is my own pressures and beliefs upon how I should perform, and internally and externally the reasons surrounding that. So I appreciate you watching, and thank you for that. I will leave a list of some recommended readings in the notes that I found to be of use for these topics, and referencing some of the stuff I've spoken about in the video. So I hope you go well with your own running journey, get stuck into it, and we'll see you next time.